this is Demi and welcome to my YouTube channel. For those who didn't know, I had a shift from being a banker to a marketer back in 2019. So today, as a marketer, I'll be exploring the potential of podcast as an integrated marketing communication tool. So, what is podcast? Here's a brief definition from Merriam-Webster. But I guess you guys have heard about internationally famous podcasts like TED Talks Daily, Serial, Views, and locally we have Boiling Waters PH, Adulting with Joy Spring, Wake Up with Jim and Sap. Podcast isn't really a new thing. It was started in 2004 by Adam Curry and Dave Winer, and since 2005, a lot of platforms have been created to support podcast listening. Some examples of these are Apple Podcasts, which was one of the pioneers, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, which is very popular today. Podcast has shown slow but steady growth, but 2018 was the start of its golden age. Infinite Dial report of Edison Research and Triton Digital in 2019 says that podcast listeners grew from 26% in 2018 to 32%. And according to a CBS News survey in January 2019, 47% of 18 to 34-year-old adults said they never listened to podcasts in the early quarters of 2018. But come January 2019, it was down to 18%. More people were turning into listeners and followers, which made marketers realize that this was an opportunity to widen their reach. Thus, the birth of podcast marketing. Brands that have engaged in podcasts have declared medium to high impact on their products or services. Sling Television, for example, said they had 2 to 3 times engagement when they got into podcast advertising compared to when they did radio advertising. Mack Weldon, a men's basic apparel brand, said their sales increased to 100%. In fact, 25% of the company's monthly ad budget is dedicated to podcast advertising. Lastly, Bombas Socks declared that they had a 15 to 40% increase in new customers. Looking at these brands, podcasts has helped from awareness stage to engagement until the purchasing stage. But what are the advantages of doing podcast marketing? Well, for one, podcasts are more intimate and personal. When you expose your brand to a podcast, it shows the brand personality while inspiring listeners. Next, podcasts can hold attention for much longer compared to video and blog content. Also, podcast speaks to a targeted audience. Each podcast show has a unique audience that can fit a brand. Next, adding podcasts to your content variety together with your social media accounts makes your brand more accessible. Lastly, podcasts are more on the go. This is because it can be downloaded offline and can be listened to anywhere, whatever you are doing. If podcast marketing has advantages, of course there are disadvantages. So what are they? Well, number one, since podcasts are still just booming now, podcast speaks to a small audience. Number two, brands that did podcast advertising might not be searchable through search engines unless it's a branded podcast. Number three, it might be a bit difficult to track effectiveness of podcast marketing unless you monitor it very closely. And lastly, some podcast apps has a feature of skipping ads, so it would be up to the podcaster's creativity on how to prevent listeners from skipping ads. Want to know more about podcast marketing? Watch part 2 of this blog and get a peep on how podcast marketing works from Linya Linya and the Skeptic and the Rusty podcasts. If you like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you on the next!